The poor but loving son. In the quiet village of Umidike, nestled between rolling hills and thick forests, lived a young man named Obinna. He was a simple man with kind eyes and a strong back, known to all as the devoted son of Mama Ijeoma. Their home was a small, mud brick hut with a thatched roof that had long since started to leak during the rains. The villagers often passed by and saw Obinna sitting outside, carving wooden sculptures with his rough, calloused hands, figures of birds, warriors, and spirits from the old stories. He sold these carvings at the village market, but no matter how many he made, the money was never enough. His mother was old, her frail body often racked with coughs, and he longed to provide for her, to see her eat a full meal without worry in her eyes. But life in Umidike was not kind to the poor. Wealth belonged to men like Chief Ezina, the village leader who lived in a house so grand that even its windows sparkled like the eyes of the gods. His son, Ekemba, was the same age as Obinna but had never known hardship. He wore fine cloth, rode a white horse, and spent his days boasting in the village square. He laughed at men like Obinna, sneering at their tattered clothes and empty pockets. One evening, as Obinna sat outside his hut, whittling a new carving, his mother sighed deeply. "My son," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I worry for you. You work hard, yet hunger follows us like a shadow. But wealth gained wrongly, it comes with a curse. Always remember this." Obinna nodded, but deep inside, his heart was heavy. What was the use of honesty if it kept them poor? A fateful encounter. The next day, Obinna took his carvings to the market as usual. The air was thick with the scent of roasting maize and the chatter of traders. He set up his small stall, hoping to sell enough to buy food. Hours passed, but no one stopped to buy. Then, as the sun began to set, a man cloaked in black robes approached. His eyes were deep and shadowed, his presence unsettling. "You are struggling, young man," the stranger said in a voice as smooth as river stones. Obinna hesitated. "I am managing." The man chuckled. "I can give you a way out." Obinna frowned. "And what must I do?" The man leaned closer. "There is a place, deep in the forest, where the gods listen. A shrine of power. If you are willing to make a sacrifice, you will never know hunger again." Obinna felt a shiver run through him. "I do not believe in such things." The man smiled knowingly. "Perhaps. But I will be here tomorrow, in case you change your mind." With that, he disappeared into the crowd. Obinna stood frozen. A shrine of power. A sacrifice. That night, he lay awake, staring at the roof of his hut. His mother's frail breaths filled the silence. The man's words whispered in his mind. And for the first time, he wondered, what if wealth was worth the price? A forbidden path to riches. Obinna spent the entire night tossing and turning, his mind haunted by the words of the mysterious man. He could still hear his mother's gentle breathing beside him, unaware of the storm raging within her son's heart. The mere thought of seeking out a shrine of dark power sent chills through his bones. He had heard the old stories, whispers of people who had wandered too deep into the forest, seeking riches, only to return changed or never return at all. But the hunger in his belly and the sorrow in his mother's eyes gnawed at him like a persistent wound. He had tried everything, worked tirelessly, carved figures with his bare hands, prayed to the gods, and even fasted for days, hoping for a blessing. Yet, his life remained the same. The next morning, as the sun began its slow rise over the horizon, Obinna made his decision. He would seek out the mysterious man. The journey into the forest. Obinna arrived at the marketplace just as traders were setting up their stalls. He scanned the crowd, searching for the cloaked figure. His heart pounded against his ribs as he worried the man would not come. But then, as if summoned by his thoughts, the figure appeared, standing in the shadows between two market stalls. "You have made your choice," the man said before Obinna could speak. I need to know what I must do, Obinna whispered, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. The man gestured for him to follow. They walked in silence, leaving the bustling market behind and heading toward the dense forest that loomed just beyond the village. The trees stretched high above them, their branches intertwining like the fingers of unseen spirits. The deeper they ventured, the darker it became, and soon the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant cry of an unseen animal. Obinna's breath was shallow as he followed the man through winding paths he had never seen before. Then, after what felt like an eternity, they reached a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a shrine, its structure ancient and covered in creeping vines. The air around it was thick with an eerie stillness, and the very ground beneath Obinna's feet felt colder than it should have. The man stepped aside, and from the shadows of the shrine, an old figure emerged. The sorcerer's demand. The man who appeared from the shrine was unlike anyone Obinna had ever seen. His skin was dark as midnight, but his eyes shone like twin embers in a dying fire. He was wrapped in thick robes adorned with strange symbols, and around his neck hung a necklace of animal bones and teeth. This was no ordinary priest. This was Bobankulu, a sorcerer whose name was feared in hushed whispers. You seek riches, young man. Bobankulu's voice was deep and commanding, sending a tremor through Obinna's spine. Obinna hesitated. Was it too late to turn back? But then he thought of his mother, of their empty cooking pot, and of his future slipping through his fingers like sand. Yes, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. I seek a better life. Bobankulu studied him for a long moment before nodding. Riches do not come freely. They require sacrifice. Are you willing to pay the price? Obinna swallowed. What must I do? The sorcerer extended a bony hand. For now, something simple. A test of commitment. Bring me a white goat by midnight. Only then will your journey begin. A white goat. That didn't sound so difficult. Obinna exhaled in relief, nodding eagerly. I will return by midnight. Good, Bobankulu said. But remember this, young one, once you take a step on this path, there is no turning back. The gods listen in silence, and they do not take broken oaths lightly. Obinna's skin prickled with unease, but he nodded nonetheless. He had already made his choice. The first sacrifice. The journey back to the village felt longer than the one into the forest. The weight of Bobankulu's words pressed down on Obinna's shoulders, but he convinced himself it was only a goat. No real harm would come from that. As he entered the village, the scent of roasted yams and palm oil greeted him, but he had no appetite. His feet carried him straight to the home of Uncle Okachukwu, a man who bred livestock. Oh, Obinna. What brings you here so late? The old man asked, his face creased with age but his eyes still sharp with wisdom. Uncle, I need to buy a white goat, Obinna said quickly. It's urgent. Okachukwu raised an eyebrow. A white goat. You do not own a farm, nor do you prepare for sacrifices. Why do you need one? Obinna forced a smile. It's for a favor I must do. Please, I will pay you when I can. The old man studied him for a long moment before sighing. I have one. But be careful, Obinna. The gods see all things, and the spirits do not forgive foolishness. Obinna nodded, taking the small goat and leading it away. The ritual begins. As midnight approached, Obinna once again walked the path into the deep forest, the goat bleating softly as he guided it. Every sound in the darkness made his heart race. The trees felt taller, the shadows darker. When he reached the shrine, Bobankulu was already waiting. Good, the sorcerer said, his voice laced with satisfaction. You are ready. Without hesitation, Bobankulu took the goat and, with a swift motion, ended its life. The blood poured into a clay bowl as the sorcerer murmured ancient incantations. The wind howled through the trees, and the ground beneath them seemed to shudder. Obinna watched in stunned silence, his hands clammy. He had never seen anything like this before. After what felt like hours, Bobankolu turned to him. The first step is complete. Now, for the true sacrifice. Obinna's mouth went dry. What do you mean? Bobankolu smiled, a slow, knowing grin. If you truly desire wealth, the gods will require more than a goat. But that will come later. For now, take this. He handed Obinna a small pouch made of animal hide. It felt unnaturally heavy in his hands. Bury this beneath the largest tree in your village before dawn, Bobankolu instructed. When you wake, your journey to riches will begin. Obinna hesitated. What is inside? The sorcerer's eyes gleamed. Do not ask questions to which you are not ready for the answers. Obinna's breath hitched, but he nodded. He had already come this far. The first taste of wealth. Just before dawn, Obinna found the tallest tree at the heart of the village and dug a shallow hole with his bare hands. The soil was cold, damp, and clung to his fingers like unseen hands. He placed the pouch inside, covering it carefully before stepping back. As he walked home, an uneasiness settled in his chest. Had he done the right thing? But the next morning, when he awoke, his fears vanished. For the first time in his life, he opened his eyes to gold coins scattered across the floor of his hut. His heart pounded wildly. The sorcerer had kept his promise. Obinna was rich. The taste of wealth. The morning sun filtered through the small cracks in Obinna's hut, casting golden beams across the dirt floor. He blinked awake, stretching lazily, until his fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. His breath caught in his throat. Gold. Scattered across the floor were shimmering gold coins, glinting in the morning light. His heart pounded. It was real. The sorcerer had kept his promise. Obinna grabbed a handful of the coins, feeling their weight. He had never seen so much wealth in his life. He trembled with excitement, his hunger, his pain, his worries, all of them vanished in an instant. But then, a cold thought crept into his mind. What was in that pouch? He shook off the feeling. It didn't matter. He was rich now. The change begins. Obinna wasted no time. He wrapped some of the coins in cloth and hurried to the market, his steps light and eager. The villagers stared in shock as he bought bags of rice, dried meat, palm oil, and fine fabrics. At first, they whispered among themselves. Wasn't he just a poor man yesterday? Did the gods bless him overnight? But as the days passed, Obinna's newfound wealth became impossible to ignore. He wore fine embroidered tunics instead of his old rags. He feasted while others scraped by. He no longer carved wooden figures, there was no need. People began flocking to him, their attitudes shifting. Ekemba, the chief's son who had once mocked him, now greeted him with forced politeness. Traders who once ignored him offered him the best goods. Women stole glances at him, their admiration clear. For the first time, Obinna felt powerful. But his mother, Mama Ijeoma, watched him with weary eyes. A mother's worry. One evening, as Obinna set a lavish meal before her, she hesitated. "My son," she said, her voice soft yet firm, "tell me the truth." Obinna feigned innocence. "About what, Mama?" She studied him. "A man does not wake up rich without reason." "What have you done?" Obinna's chest tightened. He forced a laugh. "The gods have blessed me." His mother's face darkened. "Which gods?" He looked away. Mama Ijeoma sighed deeply, her frail fingers gripping her bow. "Obinna, my son. Wealth that comes unnaturally never lasts. And worse, it demands a price." Obinna's stomach twisted, but he ignored her words. He had already paid with a simple goat, hadn't he? The sorcerer returns. That night, Obinna lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His mother's words unsettled him, but he reassured himself. Nothing bad had happened. Then, just as sleep threatened to take him, a voice slithered into his ear. Obinna. His eyes flew open. His heart was dark, yet he was not alone. A figure stood at the foot of his bed, Bobankulu. The sorcerer's glowing eyes bored into him, a slow smile creeping onto his face. You have enjoyed your wealth, Bobankulu whispered. Now, it is time for the second sacrifice. Obinna's blood ran cold. What do you mean? He stammered. I gave the goat. The sorcerer chuckled. A goat? Do you think the gods are so cheap? Obinna's breath quickened. Then, what must I give? Bobankulu's smile widened. Something greater. Someone you love. Obinna's heart stopped. No. No, no, no. The sorcerer leaned closer, his voice a whisper of doom. Your mother. The room swirled. Obinna's vision blurred. His body turned to stone. Bobankulu's final words rang in his ears. You have 3 days. If you do not bring the heart, you will either die or go mad. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, the sorcerer vanished into the shadows, leaving Obinna alone in the dark, his breath shaking with terror. The darker demand. The moment Bobankulu disappeared, Obinna felt his world shatter. The sorcerer's words echoed in his mind, wrapping around his chest like a tightening rope. Your mother. You have 3 days. The room felt smaller, suffocating. He struggled to breathe, his palms clammy with sweat. He turned his head and saw his mother sleeping peacefully just a few feet away, unaware that she had just been marked for death. Obinna stumbled outside, gulping in the cool night air. No. I can't do this. But a dark whisper coiled around his thoughts. You must. If you don't, you will die. A mind in turmoil. Obinna barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw visions, his own body writhing in madness, his mother's voice crying in agony, and Bobankulu's sinister grin. By morning, his mother noticed his unease. My son, she said gently, watching him as he barely touched his food, what is wrong? Obinna forced a smile. It's nothing, Mama. Just tired. She frowned but didn't push him further. But inside, Obinna was a storm of terror and guilt. He wandered the village aimlessly, desperate for a way out. Could he run? No, the sorcerer would find him anywhere. Could he refuse? No, the threat of madness clung to his soul. There must be another way, he told himself over and over. But with each passing hour, the weight of his decision crushed him. A desperate search for salvation. By the second day, Obinna was desperate. He visited the village priest, an old man named Dibia Chukudi, hoping for an answer. Dibia, he whispered, after ensuring they were alone, is there a way to break a blood pact? The old man froze, his eyes narrowing. Who told you about such things? Obinna hesitated, then lied, I heard it in a story. Dibia Chukudi stared at him for a long time, before shaking his head. A blood pact is the strongest of all oaths. Once made, it cannot be undone, without consequence. Obinna swallowed hard. There must be another way, he pressed, voice desperate. Dibia sighed, his tone grave. If the spirits demand blood, then blood they must have. But it does not have to be your mother's. Obinna's heart leapt with hope until he realized what the priest was saying. Another person. Someone else would have to die. The thought made his stomach churn. But as he left the priest's hut, another thought crept into his mind, Ikemba. The chief's son had mocked him, laughed at him, and treated him like dirt. Ikemba was cruel, selfish, and arrogant. And he was not innocent. Obinna's hands shook. Could he really do it? The deadline approaches. By the third night, Obinna had made up his mind. He could not take his mother's life. But he also could not allow himself to die. So he waited. In the dead of night, he picked up a knife and crept toward Ekemba's grand home. The moon cast silver shadows as he slipped past the guards and entered the house. Ekemba lay asleep, oblivious to the doom standing above him. Obinna raised the knife, his heart pounding, his breath ragged. This was justice, wasn't it? Ekemba had done nothing but cause suffering. It's him or me, Obinna thought, forcing his hand downward. But at that moment, Ekemba's eyes snapped open. In a blur, he grabbed Obinna's wrist, twisting it with shocking force. Obinna let out a cry as the knife clattered to the floor. "What are you doing?" Ekemba roared, slamming a fist into Obinna's face. Pain exploded through his skull as he staggered back, blood dripping from his nose. The noise awakened the guards, who burst into the room with spears raised. Obinna was trapped. The last thing he saw was the butt of a spear swinging toward his face, and then, darkness. The unthinkable choice. Pain. That was the first thing Obinna felt when he regained consciousness. His head throbbed, his body ached, and his vision was blurry. Slowly, the world around him came into focus, and dread settled deep in his bones. He was inside a prison hut, hands tied behind his back. The air was thick with the stench of sweat and fear. His mind raced. What happened? Then he remembered. Ekemba. The knife. The guards. His attempted murder had failed. And now, he was at the mercy of the chief's judgment. A trial before the village. The next morning, Obinna was dragged out into the village square. A large crowd had gathered. The moment they saw him, murmurs spread like wildfire. He tried to kill Ekemba. What has gotten into him? Has he gone mad? At the front of the crowd stood Chief Ezina, his face hard as stone. Ekemba stood beside him, a bandage wrapped around his arm where Obinna had barely scratched him. "You are accused of attempting to murder my son," Chief Ezina's voice boomed across the square. "You, who were once nothing, now bold enough to try and take a life." The chief's gaze darkened. "Speak. Why did you do this?" Obinna's throat was dry. What could he say? That he had made a deal with a sorcerer. That he needed Ekemba's heart to save himself. They would call him mad. And maybe he was. Obinna started, but the words wouldn't come. Ekemba scoffed, stepping forward. "He is jealous of me, father. That is all this is. He has always hated me." The crowd murmured in agreement. Obinna felt cold. This was it. He was going to die. The chief raised his staff, signaling for silence. "For your crime," he declared, "you shall be banished from the village. If you are seen here again, you will be killed." Gasps filled the air. Obinna's stomach sank. Banishment. To be cast out, alone, with nothing. But before he could protest, the guard seized him, dragging him toward the forest edge. Alone in the darkness. By the time night fell, Obinna was far from the village. His stomach rumbled with hunger, and his feet bled from walking on rough terrain. He slumped against a tree, exhaustion overtaking him. But the moment he closed his eyes, he heard a voice. "You have failed." His heart stopped. Slowly, he turned. Bobankolo stood before him, his glowing red eyes burning with fury. "You had one task," the sorcerer hissed. "And you failed." Obinna shook with fear. "Please, give me another chance." Bobankolo tilted his head. "The gods do not grant second chances." The air grew heavy, a pressure building inside Obinna's skull. He clutched his head, gasping for breath. "Stop," he choked. But the sorcerer's voice was merciless. "You owe them blood. If not Ekemba's," Bobankolu's lips curled into a cruel smile, "then your mother's." Obinna's entire body went still. "No," he whispered. The sorcerer nodded slowly. "You have until dawn. Bring the heart, or you will suffer a fate worse than death." Then, he vanished, leaving Obinna alone with his horror, the last decision. Obinna staggered back, his entire body trembling. The choice was clear now. If he wanted to live, he had to do the unthinkable. His mother. The one who had raised him, fed him, loved him. Tears streamed down his face. Could he really do this? As the night stretched on, the darkness around him grew deeper. And Obinna knew. By dawn, he had to choose. The ultimate betrayal. Obinna walked through the night, his footsteps heavy with dread. His mind was a battlefield, one side screaming for him to stop, the other whispering that he had no choice. He had until dawn. The gods demand a heart. If not Ekemba's, then your mother's. The thought made him sick. But as he reached the outskirts of the village, he felt a different sickness. The sickness of fear. If he didn't do it, he would die. Or worse, he would go mad. But could he really take the life of the one person who had always loved him? A mother's love. The small, familiar hut came into view. The flickering light of a single candle glowed inside. His mother was still awake. Obinna swallowed hard. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and stepped inside. Mama Ijeoma looked up from her seat, smiling softly. "Oh, my son. You're back." Her eyes were gentle, but they carried worry. "Where have you been?" she asked. "I was afraid something happened to you." Obinna's hands shook. Something had happened. And something worse was about to. He forced a smile, sitting beside her. "I just needed some air, Mama." She nodded, though her gaze lingered on him. "You look troubled." Obinna clenched his fist beneath the table. She had always seen right through him. Tears burned at the back of his eyes. "How can I do this? She trusts me. She loves me." But the sorcerer's voice echoed in his head. "You have until dawn." Obinna stood suddenly. "Mama, I need to get something." He stepped outside, gripping the dagger hidden in his belt. His entire body trembled. One strike. That's all it would take. Just one strike, and you will live. He turned back toward the hut, the candlelight flickering against the walls. The home where he had grown. The home she had kept for him. Could he really destroy it all? A son's betrayal. Obinna stepped back inside the hut, his hand clutching the dagger. His mother was still seated, humming an old song. The one she used to sing to him as a child. His heart broke. He stood behind her, his breath ragged, the blade hovering just above her back. The room spun around him. Tears streamed down his face. "Forgive me, Mama." Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, he closed his eyes and plunged the blade forward. The price of blood. A gasp. A sharp intake of breath. Mama Ijeoma stiffened, her body jerking violently. Then, silence, the knife slipped from Obinna's fingers, clattering to the ground. His knees buckled. His entire body shook with horror. Blood pooled beneath her. Her body slumped forward. It was done. But instead of relief, a cold emptiness filled him. His chest tightened, the walls of the hut closing in on him. He had done it. He had killed his own mother. The one person who had never abandoned him. The weight of his crime crushed him. But there was no turning back now, delivering the heart. With shaking hands, Obinna removed her heart, wrapping it in cloth. His stomach twisted, his breath coming in short gasps. He stumbled into the night, his vision blurred by tears. The forest path stretched before him, but it felt longer than before. Every step felt like a lifetime. By the time he reached the shrine, his legs were barely holding him up. Bobankulu was already waiting, his glowing eyes filled with dark satisfaction. Obinna dropped to his knees, offering the heart with trembling fingers. "I have done it," he whispered. "Give me my riches." The sorcerer smiled, taking the heart. "The gods are pleased," he murmured. "Your reward shall be great." Obinna waited. His breath shaky, his soul empty. The air grew thick, the ground rumbling beneath him. Dark whispers filled the shrine. A great wind rushed through the trees. Then, silence. Obinna looked up. The sorcerer was gone. The shrine was empty. And in his hands, nothing. A cruel trick. Obinna staggered to his feet, his heart pounding with panic. "No," he whispered. "No." He had done everything the sorcerer asked. He had given his own mother's life. But there was no gold. No riches. The shrine stood abandoned, as if Bobankulu had never been there. The truth hit him like a blade through the chest. He had been tricked. He had killed for nothing. His mother was dead. And he was still just a poor man. A broken, cursed man. Obinna screamed into the night, his cry echoing through the forest. A cry of grief. A cry of rage. A cry of a man who had lost everything. The curse of a murderer. Obinna stood frozen in the clearing, his mind refusing to accept the truth. The sorcerer was gone. The shrine was empty. And his mother was dead, for nothing. The weight of his actions crashed down on him, suffocating, crushing his soul into dust. He had killed the only person who had ever truly loved him, and in return, he had received nothing. The wind howled through the trees, mocking him, whispering his mother's name. Ejioma. The sound sent a shudder through his body, and suddenly, a terrible pain exploded in his chest. Obinna fell to his knees, clutching at his head as darkness crawled over his vision. It started as a whisper. Then a laughter. A voice that sounded almost familiar. "Did you really think the gods would reward a murderer?" Obinna gasped, his breath shallow and broken. His mother's blood was still on his hands. He tried to rub it away, but no matter how hard he scrubbed, it remained. Permanent. A mark of his crime. The whispers grew louder, twisting into the voices of the villagers, of Ikemba, of the chief, of his own mother. "My son, why did you do this? Murderer! You will never be free." Obinna screamed, clutching his head, but the voices only grew stronger. Then, a shadow loomed before him. His heart stopped. He looked up, and his blood ran cold. There, standing before him, was Mama Ijeoma. But her eyes were hollow, her skin gray and lifeless, her hands dripping with blood. Obinna's mouth opened in a silent cry. The world tilted, his vision blurring at the edges. And then, everything went black. The awakening. When Obinna opened his eyes, the sun was high in the sky. He was lying in the dirt, his clothes torn, his body weak. For a moment, he thought it had all been a dream. But then he saw it. The shrine. The blood on his hands. And he knew. It was real. A deep, aching cold settled in his chest. His mother was gone. His home was gone. His chance at wealth was gone. And he was alone. But something was different. The air around him felt wrong. His own body felt wrong. When he tried to stand, a sharp pain shot through his limbs, and for the first time, he noticed. His shadow was no longer his own. Instead of moving as he did, it twisted and stretched unnaturally, its fingers clawing at the ground, its edges shifting like smoke. A curse. Obinna staggered back in horror. He had given his mother's heart, and in return, the gods had taken his soul. He was no longer a man. He was a wraith, a cursed being, forever trapped between the world of the living and the dead. The village's wrath. For days, Obinna wandered the forest, unable to sleep, unable to eat. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her. His mother. Watching him. Judging him. And no matter how far he walked, her voice never left his ears. My son, why? Eventually, he found himself at the edge of the village. His feet had taken him home, but he was no longer welcome there. The moment the villagers saw him, a cry of horror rang through the air. He is cursed. A ghost in human skin. The elders gathered quickly, their faces grim. One of them, an old woman with sight beyond the ordinary, stepped forward. She studied Obinna for a long moment before speaking. This is the price of greed. He took his mother's life, and now, he is neither living nor dead. A murmur spread through the crowd. What do we do with him? He cannot stay. The elder spoke in hushed tones, then turned back to him. You are no longer one of us, Obinna. You will be cast into the forest, never to return. If you are seen here again, you will be burned alive. Obinna felt nothing. Not fear. Not anger. Just emptiness. He turned without a word, walking away from the only home he had ever known. And the villagers watched in silence, knowing they had just witnessed the fate of a man who had given everything to greed, and lost even more. A ghost in the forest. From that day forward, Obinna became a legend. Travelers spoke of a shadowed figure wandering the woods, his face half hidden in the mist, his eyes hollow and empty. They said his voice whispered on the wind, calling out for his mother. And that if you listened too closely, you would hear her weeping back. But no one ever saw him twice. Because those who met him never returned. And so, the people of Umidike told his story for generations, warning their children. Never let greed rule your heart. Or you, too, will pay the price.